Welcome to our deep dive on fear. And, it feels like fear is absolutely everywhere these days. I mean, in the news, on social media, heck, even in those targeted ads that seem to know exactly what makes you tick or I guess what makes you scared. So I'm going to dive into some really interesting sources today that look at, how fear works, how it's used, and most importantly, how we can get a handle on it.
Yeah, it's a really timely topic. And I think, we often think of fear as this primal instinct, right? Like it's the thing that keeps us safe from danger.
Right.
But the thing is that same instinct can be hijacked. It can make us afraid of things that aren't actually threats to our survival.
Exactly. And I'm not going to lie, sometimes, just seeing a breaking news notification on my phone is enough to send my heart racing.
Yeah.
But it's usually nothing I actually need to be afraid of. So how does this even work? One of the videos you sent, Sense of Mind, talked about this thing called the amygdala in our brains.
Right. Yeah. The amygdala. It's like our brain's internal alarm system. It's constantly scanning for threats. And when it thinks it's found one, bam, hormones flood your system. You get that fight or flight response and all to prepare you to either fight off the danger or run away.
Okay, so that explains the heart racing thing. But what's fascinating to me is how this whole system can be manipulated. I mean, it's not just about surviving a bear attack anymore, right? There's a whole other layer of fear that seems to be playing out in society.
Absolutely. And the Academy of Ideas video we looked at really digs into this. It shows how fear has been used as a tool of control for centuries. I mean, think about dictatorships, regimes like Nazi Germany or Stalinist Russia. I mean, they thrived on creating an atmosphere of constant fear.
And it's not just about outright violence either. There's this quote from the video that really stuck with me. A German citizen reflecting on the Nazi regime said, "You wait for one great shocking occasion, but the one great shocking occasion never comes." It's like that fear can creep in so gradually that you don't even realize it's happening.
Exactly. And what's even scarier is that this manipulation, it isn't limited to those extreme historical examples. The Mr. Brain video describes this concept called menticide, which is essentially, a way of breaking down critical thinking to make people more vulnerable to control.
So it's not just about making people afraid. It's about making them confused and less able to think for themselves honestly. That makes you think twice about all the information that's thrown at us these days, right?
Absolutely. And it's not just governments doing this either. I mean, the Gem-Veda video we had talks about how this plays out in everything from the news to politics to even how we choose our careers. It's like we're constantly being bombarded with these messages that are designed to make us afraid, whether it's about our health, our finances, or the future of the world.
It's true. Just think about, those news headlines that make it seem like the world is ending every other day, or those political campaigns that are all about making you afraid of the other side.
Yeah.
It's exhausting.
It really is. And then we can't forget about social media. The Mind and Fortune video, they actually brought up this term, headline anxiety. And it's basically that feeling of being constantly stressed and anxious because of this never-ending stream of negativity. And then, of course, you've got the algorithms that are designed to keep you hooked, showing you more and more of the stuff that triggers those fear responses.
Yeah, it's almost like we're addicted to fear at this point.
Yeah.
The Mr. Brain video actually mentioned this study where MIT researchers found that fear-inducing content is way more likely to be shared than neutral stuff. So it's not just that we're consuming it, we're spreading it too.
Yeah.
I mean, that's got to make you wonder about your own social media habits, right? Like how much of what you're seeing is actually real and how much of it is just designed to, keep you scrolling and keep you feeling afraid.
That's the key question, and this is where things get really interesting, because it's not just about feeling anxious or clicking on the next headline, this constant state of fear. It can actually make us act irrationally, even against our own best interests.
Okay, so give me an example. How does this actually play out in real life?
Well, the Academy of Ideas video discusses this philosopher, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and he lived through the rise of Nazi Germany, and he talked about how fear can actually lead to a kind of stupidity. And he wasn't talking about, stupidity in a mean way.
Right.
What he meant was that when people stop thinking critically, when they're driven by fear, they become much easier to manipulate, even if their intentions are good.
So it's like that saying, ignorance is bliss, but in this case, ignorance is actually dangerous.
Exactly. Bonhoeffer, he argued that unthinking obedience to authority when it's fueled by fear is one of the most dangerous things in society. And this connects to what another thinker, Hannah Arendt, called the banality of evil. She studied the people who carried out the Holocaust, and what she found was that many of them weren't, inherently evil people, but rather they were just blindly following orders, not really thinking for themselves.
That is terrifying. So it's not always about bad people doing bad things. Sometimes it's about ordinary people getting swept up in a system that preys on their fears.
That's the scary part. And what's even more concerning is that as that Mr. Brain video argues this kind of menticide, it isn't just a historical phenomenon, It's happening all around us, subtly shaping our perceptions and influencing our choices.
Okay, at this point, I'm starting to feel a little hopeless. Is there any way to break free from this? Are we just doomed to be controlled by fear?
Not at all. Actually, several of the sources you sent, they offer some really helpful solutions. The Arcane Reflections video, I think, put it perfectly. They said, understanding the role of fear is the first step toward resisting its control.
So knowledge is power, as they say. The more we understand how fear works, the less we'll fall prey to it.
Exactly. And there's some really practical things we can do, too. Mind and Fortune talked about the importance of taking breaks from social media and the news, giving ourselves space to think clearly and to process information without that constant barrage of negativity. It's like a mental detox,
Yeah, digital detox. I actually tried that recently, and it was amazing how much calmer I felt.
Right. And then Jamveda suggested becoming more active in how we process information. Don't just accept what you're told. Ask questions, look for different perspectives, and take responsibility for your own emotional state.
So be more critical, more curious, and more in control. I like it.
Right.
But what about those deeper fears? The ones that aren't tied to a specific news story or social media post, like the fear of death, the fear of failure, the unknown. That stuff seems baked into us.
That's where philosophy can really help you. Send over this video about Baruch Spinoza. He was a 17th century philosopher who had a really interesting take on fear. He believed that a lot of our fear comes from a misunderstanding of reality. We fear what we don't understand. We cling to these illusions of control, and we resist the natural order of things.
Okay, that's a lot to unpack. So he's saying that knowledge is the key to overcoming fear.
That's part of it, yes. Spinoza argued that the more we understand how the universe works, the less we'll be afraid of it. But he also emphasized the importance of acceptance, letting go of what we can't control.
That makes sense, but how do you actually do that? It sounds pretty abstract.
Well, the Philosophy Playground video actually broke it down into 3 principles. First, learn to observe your emotions objectively without immediately reacting to them. Second, use reason to analyze situations rather than letting your emotions kind of distort reality. And third, accept the things you can't change instead of resisting them.
Okay, I get the accepting what we can't control part, but how do you actually observe your emotions objectively? That sounds pretty tough. Like when I'm freaking out about something, it's not like I can just detach and analyze it calmly.
It takes practice for sure, but Spinoza believed that by developing this kind of self-awareness, we can start to see our fears more clearly and challenge their validity.
So it's about recognizing when we're letting our emotions run the show, taking a step back and seeing things from a more rational perspective.
Exactly. And it's about realizing that our thoughts and feelings, they're not always an accurate reflection of reality. They're often influenced by our past experiences, our beliefs, and our biases.
That's so true. I know I have a tendency to catastrophize. Like, imagine the worst case scenario in every situation.
That's a really common human tendency, and it's often fueled by fear. But by learning to observe our thoughts and emotions without judgment, we can start to kind of disentangle ourselves from those negative thought patterns.
It's like becoming more mindful of our own internal dialogue.
Exactly. And that's where practices like mindfulness and meditation can be incredibly helpful. They teach us to pay attention to the present moment, to become more aware of our thoughts and feelings, and to observe them without getting swept away by them.
So it's about cultivating a sense of inner peace and stability, even when the world around us feels chaotic and uncertain.
Exactly. And that inner peace, it can be a powerful antidote to fear. It allows us to face challenges with more clarity, courage, and resilience.
Okay, this is all starting to make sense. We've got the biology of fear, that amygdala going off like a fire alarm. Then we've got this social layer where fear is used to manipulate and control us. And then we've got these philosophical tools for, understanding and overcoming our own fears.
Right. And what's exciting is that these different layers, they're all interconnected by understanding the biology of fear. We can be more aware of how it's being used against us. And by developing philosophical tools for managing our own fears, we can become more resistant to manipulation and more empowered to make choices that align with our values.
So it's a holistic approach, tackling fear from multiple angles. I like it. But how do we put all of this into practice? It still feels kind of abstract. Let's talk about some concrete examples, like what are some ways that fear shows up in our everyday lives, and how can we use these insights to navigate those situations more effectively?
That's a great question. Let's start by looking at how fear is used in marketing and advertising.
Okay, marketing and advertising. I feel like fear is practically the foundation of the entire industry. You see it everywhere. Those commercials for home security systems that show like scary intruders, or those ads for life insurance that make you think about, all the worst case scenarios.
You're absolutely right. They play on our deepest fears, making us feel like we need their product to stay safe and protected.
It's like they're bypassing our, rational minds and going straight for our emotional gut punch. And it's not just about selling products, right? It feels like fear is used to shape our behavior in all sorts of subtle ways.
Absolutely. The Mind and Fortune video we watched talked about how this plays out in healthcare, for example. We're bombarded with messages about potential health risks, new diseases, and the importance of getting tested for everything under the sun. And while preventative care is essential, sometimes it feels like this fear-based approach leads to overdiagnosis, unnecessary treatments, and a whole lot of unnecessary anxiety.
Yeah, it's like, be afraid, be very afraid, and then buy our pills. But it's not just about selling us things or making us worry about our health.
Yeah.
Fear also seems to be a pretty powerful tool in the world of politics.
It's a classic strategy. The Mr. Brain video talked about how politicians use fear to create this us versus them mentality.
Yeah.
They make people afraid of outsiders, afraid of change, afraid of anything that challenges the status quo. And then they present themselves as, the strong leader who can keep everyone safe.
It's that old divide and conquer trick. Make people afraid of each other, and they'll be more likely to cling to those in power. It's actually kind of brilliant in a really messed up way.
It's effective, that's for sure. And it tends to work especially well during times of, crisis or uncertainty, when people are already feeling scared and vulnerable. They're more likely to crave that strong leadership and less likely to question authority.
Which is why it's so important to be media savvy, right? To really question the information that we're being fed, especially when it's coming from, people in positions of power. I think we need to ask ourselves, who benefits from spreading this fear? What are their motives?
That's critical. And the Jem Veda video actually made a really similar point about how fear is sometimes used in education. They argue that the constant pressure to get good grades, get into the right college, and land a high-paying job, it can create this culture of fear and anxiety that actually prevents kids from, being creative and exploring their real passions.
Yeah, it's like we're teaching them to be afraid of failure instead of encouraging them to take risks and learn from their mistakes. And that kind of fear can follow you for your whole life, holding you back from going after your dreams or speaking up for what you believe in.
That's a really good point. We've been talking a lot about external sources of fear, the news, advertising, politics, but, sometimes the most powerful fears, they come from within our own insecurities, doubts, and that negative self-talk that can really hold us back.
Right, that inner critic that tells us we're not good enough, not smart enough, not worthy enough, that stuff can be really debilitating. Is that where those three principles from Spinoza come in, the whole observe, analyze, accept thing.
Exactly. By becoming more aware of our thoughts and emotions, by analyzing them rationally, and by accepting the things we can't control, we can start to loosen the grip that fear has on our minds.
Okay, but let's be real. That's easier said than done.
Yeah.
How do you actually put those principles into practice, especially when you're like in the middle of a full-blown freak-out moment?
It's definitely a process and it takes practice, but think of it as building a muscle. The more you exercise that self-awareness muscle, the stronger it gets. Mindfulness can be a big help here.
Mindfulness, like meditation and stuff? I've tried that before, but my mind always wanders.
It's totally normal for your mind to wander. That's the whole point of mindfulness, to notice those thoughts popping up without getting carried away by them. It's like training yourself to be an observer of your own mind rather than being controlled by it.
Yeah, okay, I can see how that could be helpful. But let's get back to those real-life situations for a minute. We've talked about fear in marketing, politics, and even education. What about those fears that seem more personal, like the fear of public speaking or the fear of failure?
Those are great examples, and they actually tie into something that one of the sources you sent, the TEDx Talks video, explored really well. The speaker, her name was Victoria. She talked about how she overcame her fear of finishing her PhD. She was so close to achieving her goal, but she was completely paralyzed by anxiety and self-doubt.
Oh, I can relate to that.
Yeah.
I've definitely had moments where fear has made me want to just give up on something that was really important to me. So what helped her get through it?
It was knowledge. She realized that her fear was actually stemming from a lack of understanding, of herself and her own capabilities.
So it's like that whole fear of the unknown thing. The more we understand something, the less scary it becomes.
Exactly. And this actually reminded me of something from the Psychosis video, which explored this idea of a fundamental fear, that underlies many of our anxieties. And they suggested that this base fear, this fundamental fear, might be the fear of the unknown.
That makes a lot of sense when we don't know what to expect. When things feel out of our control, our brains go into overdrive trying to, protect us from potential threats.
Right. And that's where those survival instincts we talked about earlier come into play, that fight or flight response kicking in even when there's no real danger.
So how do we deal with this fear of the unknown? Is it even possible to overcome something that seems so deeply ingrained in our, psyche?
Well, the Psych video suggested that while we might not be able to eliminate it entirely, we can learn to manage it more effectively. And one way to do that is to focus on creating a sense of familiarity and predictability in our lives.
So like having a routine, sticking to a schedule, surrounding ourselves with familiar things and people.
Exactly. That can help reduce those feelings of uncertainty and anxiety. And it's also about challenging that tendency to catastrophize, to always imagine the worst case scenario.
Oh, I am the queen of catastrophizing. But you're right. Most of the time, things don't actually turn out as badly as we imagine they will.
Right. It's like that saying, we suffer more in our imagination than in reality. So instead of letting our minds run wild with what ifs, it's about grounding ourselves in the present moment, focusing on what we can control, and developing coping mechanisms for dealing with the things we can't.
And that's where mindfulness comes in again, right?
Mm-hmm.
Learning to be present, to observe our thoughts without judgment, and to, focus on our breath. It's about training our minds to be less reactive and more resilient.
Oh, you got it. And it's not about being perfect. It's about progress. Some days will be easier than others. The key is to keep practicing, keep learning, and keep moving forward.
Speaking of moving forward, there's another fear I wanted to talk about, one that feels especially relevant in today's world, the fear of social judgment. With social media, it's like we're constantly being watched, evaluated, compared. How do we deal with that constant scrutiny?
That's a big one, and the Dark Minds Decoded video actually dives deep into how that fear can be used to manipulate and control us. They point out that this fear, it's actually deeply ingrained in our evolutionary wiring as social creatures. We have this primal need for belonging and acceptance.
Right, so we're afraid of being ostracized, ridiculed, rejected by the group, and it feels like that fear is just amplified in the digital age where our lives are increasingly, played out online.
Right. Social media, it creates this culture of comparison where we're constantly bombarded with images and stories of people who seem to have it all, the perfect bodies, the perfect lives, the endless social approval. And it's easy to feel like you just don't measure up.
Totally. It's like we're all living in this giant popularity contest, constantly vying for likes and followers. And that fear of not being good enough can be totally paralyzing.
And this is where those manipulators come in, using that fear to their advantage. Dark Minds Decoded talked about how marketers, politicians, even religious institutions, they tap into that fear of social judgment. They make us feel like we need to buy certain products, believe certain things, or behave in certain ways to be accepted and to avoid rejection.
It's like that whole keeping up with the Joneses mentality, but on a global scale. So how do we break free from this cycle? How do we reclaim our individuality and the freedom to be ourselves, even if it means not fitting in?
The Dark Minds Decoded video emphasized awareness as a first step. The more we understand how this fear is being used against us, the less power it has over us.
Yeah.
They also encouraged us to question the narratives and social norms that are being presented to us, to challenge the idea that our worth is determined by external validation. So it's about developing a stronger sense of self, a sense of worth that's not dependent on, the approval of others. That sounds great in theory, but how do we actually do that?
Well, it starts with recognizing that you have the power to choose your own values, your own tribe, your own path, regardless of what other people might think. It's about having the courage to stand up for what you believe in, even if it means facing criticism or rejection.
It's about reclaiming your power, your voice, and your freedom to be yourself. I love that. But it's also about recognizing that fear can be a positive force, right? It can motivate us to take action to protect ourselves and those we care about and to stand up for what's right.
Absolutely. Think about all the activists and revolutionaries throughout history who faced incredible dangers and risked everything to fight for justice and equality.
Or the scientists and explorers who ventured into the unknown, pushing the boundaries of human knowledge and understanding.
Or the artists and creators who defied social norms and expressed their unique visions, enriching the world with their creativity and courage. Those are some inspiring examples. It's like fear can be a powerful fuel when it's aligned with our values and our sense of purpose.
And that brings us to another really important point. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's about feeling the fear and doing it anyway. It's about taking action despite those feelings of doubt, uncertainty, and discomfort.
That reminds me of something else from that TEDx Talks video, Victoria, the speaker. She said something like, fear is a feeling, but courage is a choice. I love that it means we don't have to wait until we feel brave to act bravely. We can choose courage in any moment, regardless of how we feel.
You're absolutely right. And the more we practice courage, the more natural it becomes. It's like building a muscle. The more we use it, the stronger it gets.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground here. From the science of fear, to the social and political forces that use it against us, to the philosophical tools for overcoming it, and the importance of choosing courage. But before we wrap up, I want to talk about one more crucial aspect of fear, its relationship to freedom.
That's an interesting connection on the surface. They seem like opposites. Fear can make us feel trapped, limited, powerless, while freedom implies choice agency, a sense of possibility.
Yet, as we've been discussing, fear can be used to control us, to limit our choices, and to restrict our freedoms. Think about authoritarian regimes that use fear to suppress dissent and to maintain their grip on power, or think about social pressures that can make us afraid to be ourselves, to express our true thoughts and feelings.
And here's the thing, true freedom requires courage. And courage often means facing our fears, challenging the status quo, and standing up for what we believe in, even when it's hard.
It means stepping outside of our comfort zones, embracing the unknown, and taking risks even if it means failing or being rejected.
So true freedom, then, is not the absence of fear, but the triumph over it. It's about having the courage to act in alignment with our values, our passions, and our purpose, even when we're afraid.
That's a powerful way to put it. So how do we cultivate that kind of courage? How do we move from a place of fear to a place of freedom?
Well, it starts with understanding that fear is often an illusion, a story we tell ourselves that might not be true. It's about questioning those stories, challenging our assumptions, and gathering more information. And it's about recognizing that we have a choice in every moment to either let fear control us or to choose courage, to choose freedom.
That's inspiring, but I think it's also important to acknowledge that, this is a journey, not a destination. We're not going to magically become fearless overnight. It's about taking small steps, facing our fears one at a time, and celebrating those small victories along the way.
Absolutely. It's about recognizing that setbacks are part of the process and that each time we fall, we have an opportunity to learn to grow and to get back up stronger.
I like that it's about being kind to ourselves, recognizing that, we're all works in progress and that it's okay to be afraid sometimes.
Exactly. And remember, you don't have to do it alone. There are people who care about you, resources available, and a whole community of support out there for those who are willing to, reach out and ask for help.
Okay, we've talked about fear in all its complexity, from the biological to the social to the personal and the political. We've seen how it can be used against us, how it can hold us back, and how we can overcome it. But let's shift gears for a moment and consider this. Can fear ever be a good thing?
That's a great question. It might seem counterintuitive, but fear can actually be a really valuable teacher. It can alert us to danger, motivate us to take action, and help us set healthy boundaries.
Okay, give me an example. How can fear actually be helpful?
Well, think about the fear of getting hurt. It might motivate you to wear a seatbelt when you're driving or to be careful when, crossing a busy street. The fear of failure can push you to work harder, to prepare more thoroughly, and to strive for excellence.
So it's like fear is a built-in alarm system, designed to protect us from harm and guide us towards making better choices.
Exactly. The key is to listen to that alarm system, to acknowledge its message, and to respond in a way that is both protective and empowering.
So it's not about ignoring our fears or letting them control us. It's about using them as information, as a guide for, navigating the world and making decisions that align with our values.
You got it. And it's also about recognizing that not all fears are created equal. Some fears are rational and based on, real threats, while others are irrational and based on distorted perceptions or past traumas.
So how do we know the difference? How do we distinguish between healthy fear and unhealthy fear?
That's a good question. A good question to ask yourself is this fear based on facts, or is it based on assumptions? Is this fear serving me, or is it hindering me? Is this fear helping me stay safe, or is it keeping me stuck?
So if a fear is stopping you from living your life, if it's causing you a ton of anxiety or distress, or if it just doesn't feel rational, then it might be time to challenge that fear and to seek support.
Right, and remember, overcoming fear is a process, not an event. It takes time, patience, and a willingness to be uncomfortable. But with each step, each act of courage, you become stronger, more resilient, and more capable of living the life you want.
And sometimes the bravest thing you can do is just show up even when you're afraid. It's about being vulnerable, being okay with not having all the answers, and be willing to ask for help when you need it.
That's so true. It's about recognizing that we're all human, we all make mistakes, and we don't have to be perfect to be worthy of love and belonging.
I love that message. It's about embracing our imperfections, acknowledging our limitations, and remembering that we're all in this together.
And it's about remembering that fear, while a powerful emotion doesn't have to define us, we have the power to choose how we respond to fear, to transform it from a source of limitation to a catalyst for growth.
Okay, so we've explored a ton of ground here.
Yeah.
We've talked about the biology of fear, how it's used to manipulate us, how we can use it as a tool for growth, and how it all relates to freedom. But before we wrap up, I want to circle back to something you mentioned earlier about Bertrand Russell's ideas. You mentioned that he had some concerns about how societies often reward ignorance and punish intelligence. Can you elaborate on that a bit more?
Sure. Russell argued that this tendency, it has a lot to do with power dynamics and the desire to maintain the status quo. Intelligent people, they tend to be the ones who question authority, challenge assumptions, and propose new ideas, which can be pretty threatening to those in power who benefit from the existing order of things.
So it's about control. You keep people in the dark, they're less likely to, make waves.
Precisely. And Russell pointed out that this tendency to punish intelligence, it often manifests in subtle ways. Think about how intellectuals are often stereotyped as being out-of-touch elitist or even dangerous.
Right. It's like that saying, the nail that sticks out gets hammered down.
Yeah.
It can create a climate where people are afraid to speak their minds, to challenge the status quo, or to pursue, intellectual pursuits that might make them stand out from the crowd.
Exactly. And that creates this vicious cycle, of ignorance. The more intelligence is punished, the less people are willing to be intelligent, and the easier it becomes for those in power to maintain control.
So it's not just about individual fears. It's about, societal structures that perpetuate fear and ignorance. So what can we do about this? How do we break this cycle and create a culture that actually values and rewards intelligence?
Oh, I think education is absolutely key. We need to foster critical thinking skills from a young age, encourage curiosity and exploration, and create spaces where people feel safe to question, to debate, and to express their ideas without fear of judgment or ridicule.
That sounds like a pretty big cultural shift, a move away from, blind obedience towards a more critical and engaged citizenry.
Exactly. And it starts with each of us. We can choose to value knowledge, to seek out diverse perspectives, to engage in respectful dialogue, and to support those who are brave enough to challenge the status quo. And maybe, just maybe, we can create a world where intelligence is celebrated, not suppressed, and where the pursuit of knowledge is seen as a path to freedom, not a threat to power.
That's a beautiful vision, and one that I think Spinoza would wholeheartedly support. After all, his entire philosophy was based on the idea that understanding is the key to liberation.
Right, and liberation from fear is essential for, true happiness and fulfillment.
Okay, we've covered so much ground today. You've given us a lot to think about, from the science of fear to its social and political implications, and to the philosophical tools for overcoming it. What's the key takeaway you want our listener to remember from this deep dive?
Well, the most important thing to remember is that fear is a powerful force, but it doesn't have to control you by understanding how fear works, how it's used against us, and how we can challenge our own fear-based thinking. We can become more resilient, we can make better decisions, and ultimately live freer, more fulfilling lives.
So it's about becoming more aware of our fears, more critical of the information we're given, more courageous in our actions, and more aligned with our true selves.
Exactly. And it's about recognizing that we have a choice to either succumb to fear or to rise above it.
And that the path to freedom lies not in the absence of fear, but in the courage to face it, to understand it, and to use it as fuel for growth and transformation.
Well said. So, dear listener, as you go about your day, remember the insights we've explored and the stories we've shared. Remember that fear is a natural human emotion, but it doesn't have to rule your life. Knowledge is power. Understanding is the antidote to fear. And you have the strength within you to choose courage over fear, freedom over control, and authenticity over conformity.
Those are powerful words to end on. Thank you so much for guiding us through this deep dive into the world of fear. It's been truly enlightening.
My pleasure. Remember, the journey to freedom begins with a single step, and you're not alone on that journey. We're all in this together.
It's interesting how we've gone from the primal fear response, running from tigers, to these complex societal structures that use fear to manipulate and control us.
Yeah, it really speaks to how adaptable fear is. I mean, it's not just about physical survival anymore. It's about power influence and shaping perceptions.
And it's everywhere. We've talked about marketing, politics, education. I mean, you can even scroll through social media these days without encountering some fear-mongering headline or another.
That's true, and it's easy to feel overwhelmed, even helpless in the face of all that negativity.
So what can we do about it? How do we reclaim our power and navigate this world, without constantly feeling afraid?
Well, that's where those philosophical tools we discussed earlier come in, and, remember Spinoza? He believed that understanding is the key to liberation. The more we understand about ourselves, about the world, and about the nature of fear itself, the less power it has over us.
Right, that whole observe, analyze, accept approach. But how does that actually play out in real life? Like, let's say I'm scrolling through social media and I come across a post that triggers, a fear response in me. What do I do?
First, notice that fear. Don't try to push it away or ignore it. Just acknowledge that it's there.
Okay, so step one, awareness. Got it. What's next?
Then ask yourself, what's the story I'm telling myself about the situation? What are the facts and what are my assumptions?
So step two is about separating fact from fiction, challenging those automatic thoughts that might be based on fear rather than reality.
Exactly. And this is where those critical thinking skills come in. Is the information you're seeing coming from a reliable source? Does it align with your values and your understanding of the world?
It's about being a discerning consumer of information.
Yeah.
Not just blindly accepting everything we see and hear, but really evaluating it critically.
Right. And then finally, consider this. Can I control this situation? If the answer is yes, then take action. If the answer is no, then practice acceptance.
So it's about focusing our energy on the things we can control and letting go of the things we can't. Easier said than done sometimes.
It takes practice, that's for sure. But the more we practice these skills, awareness, critical thinking, and acceptance, the more empowered we become.
So it's not about becoming fearless. It's about becoming fear savvy. Understanding how fear works and developing tools to manage it effectively.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that fear is a natural human emotion, but it doesn't have to run our lives.
That's a really empowering message. But I think it's also important to remember that we're not alone in this journey. We all experience fear. We all struggle with, those negative thoughts and feelings sometimes, and that's okay.
Absolutely. It's about being kind to ourselves, remembering that, we're all works in progress and reaching out for support when we need it.
Speaking of support, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive. You've given us so much to think about, from the science of fear to its social and political implications, to the philosophical tools for overcoming it, and the importance of choosing courage.
Yeah, it's been a fascinating journey, exploring all these different facets of fear. I hope it's been helpful.
It definitely has. So as we leave our listener to ponder all this newfound wisdom, what's the one message you want them to take away from this deep dive?
Remember, this fear is a powerful force, but it doesn't have to control you. You have the power to choose how you respond to fear, to challenge your assumptions, and to create a more positive and empowering narrative, for yourself and for the world.
That's a beautiful message. So, dear listener, go forth with courage, with curiosity, and with a heart full of hope. Remember, you are stronger than you think, braver than you believe, and more capable than you can imagine. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.